Julian, a beta, had shared a life with Carter, his alpha, for 7 years. Their wedding was a week away when the meticulously constructed facade of their relationship finally fractured. Carter had decided on a moment of brutal honesty, explaining that while he loved Julian, his fundamental nature drew him irresistibly toward Omegas. As if to punctuate the confession, he had brought one home. The Omega, Leo, was now a silent presence in their sprawling Manhattan penthouse. The foundations of Julian and Carter's union were a complex mix of genuine affection and the strategic merging of two powerful families. It was a partnership of equals, one that had slowly eroded over time. It had been 2 years since they last shared a bed. Carter's nights were increasingly spent elsewhere, his late returns punctuated by quiet instructions to the housekeeper to prepare the guest room. The signs of an affair had been there, subtle at first, but Julian had chosen to maintain the harmonious veneer of their life. Now Carter was no longer hiding. He stood before Julian, proposing they proceed with the wedding. He claimed his love was unchanged, a bedrock truth, but he was like a parched tree, helplessly drawn to the life-giving reign of a young Omega. Carter even suggested Julian seek companionship elsewhere, to find what he could no longer provide. It wasn't a discussion, it was a decree, and Leo was the proof. The young Omega was a study in quiet perfection. His dark eyes held a deep, liquid quality, framed by lashes that curled like delicate petals. Julian felt a strange, subterranean shift the first time he looked at him, a sense of something breaking far beneath the surface. Carter had introduced him as Leo, his voice full of a proprietary pride, the way a collector unveils a priceless artifact. The satisfaction in Carter's gaze was a quiet devastation for Julian to witness. Leo himself was docile, a beautiful object perfectly cared for, speaking only when prompted by Carter. Julian's response was clipped but civil. His breeding precluded any public display of humiliation. After Leo was gone, Julian issued his own ultimatum. Carter could have Leo live there, but only after their engagement was officially terminated. Carter had just smiled, a disarming gesture that held no real warmth. He explained that Leo would not be moving in. A luxury apartment had already been arranged. Furthermore, he had no intention of ending things with Julian. No one could replace him, he insisted, reminding Julian of the corporate marriage that bound them. Any disruption would cause immense difficulty for everyone involved. For Valentine's Day, Carter had booked the city's most exclusive restaurant. Not for them, but for a full day he planned to spend with Leo at an adjacent hotel. With a complete lack of self-awareness, he asked Julian for advice on what gifts were currently in vogue. Julian, maintaining a frigid composure, offered no suggestions for the absurd request. Carter departed without apology, sincerely suggesting Julian attend a friend's party to amuse himself. He was so certain of Julian's compliance, so sure that Julian would always prioritize the bigger picture. Carter had molded him this way, step by step, through years of quiet betrayals. The unfamiliar scent on his collar, the stray lipstick stain, the late-night texts. His initial denials had long ago faded into knowing smiles. After countless cycles of doubt and self-repair, Julian thought he had made peace with Carter's secrets. But this open display was different. It was exhausting. He called for his driver. Their lives were so intertwined, shared properties with ambiguous deeds, a joint investment firm, that separating would be a nightmare. But his mind was made up. He had his lawyer draft a comprehensive separation of assets, a clean break. As he methodically signed his name, Julian Sterling, on each page, he felt a flicker of his former self returning. Leaving the law firm, he noticed a bouquet of roses and a gift-wrapped box under the receptionist's desk. It seemed everyone had plans for the evening. A sudden, sharp pang of self-doubt struck him. Had he lost his appeal entirely? Driven by this question, he had the driver take him to the party in Malibu. The house was a monument of glass and white stone overlooking the Pacific. Inside, the air was thick with heat and chlorine from the pool, where muscular bodies glistened under the lights. It was a marketplace of youthful flesh, and for a moment Julian felt like a prime cut of beef on display, assessed for quality and flavor. But the predatory gazes quickly slid away. He was just a beta. He found his friend, and they settled on a sofa in a quieter corner. That's when he saw him. A young man, likely a college student, leaning against a far wall. He was dressed in worn jeans that did little to conceal the powerful lines of his thighs, and a simple white t-shirt stretched across a broad chest and narrow waist. He hadn't entered the pool, instead observing the boisterous crowd with a searching, almost feral intensity. As Julian watched, the young man's gaze swept the room and locked with his. After a beat, he pushed off the wall and moved through the crowd with purpose, heading directly for him. He introduced himself as Ethan. He asked point-blank if Julian had a date for the evening, and if not, would he consider him? The directness was both startling and refreshing. Julian reflexively began to decline, but his friend nudged him, whispering not to waste the opportunity. Julian gave Ethan his number, stayed for another 30 minutes to be polite, and then left. Later that night, a text arrived from Ethan, inviting him to dinner. After a moment of consideration, Julian forwarded the number to a private investigator. He had grown accustomed to operating within a perimeter of safety and knowledge. The background report came back quickly. Satisfied, he prepared for the evening. He lingered in the bath, tracing the lines of his own body. It was smooth, well-kept, but felt barren, a landscape without vitality. Ethan had chosen a renowned French-American restaurant downtown. He was wearing a dark suit and his hair was slicked back, a clear effort to impress. The formality didn't quite sit right on him. He occasionally tugged at his collar, a small gesture of discomfort. Still, he was a perfect gentleman, pulling out Julian's chair and inquiring about his preferences. Julian knew the place well. He was a Black Card member. The price of the meal, something Ethan was clearly stretching to afford, was not lost on him. He looked at Ethan properly then. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, a deep, crystalline shade that seemed to refract the low light of the restaurant into something dreamlike. Julian remarked that Ethan must be of mixed heritage. Ethan's gaze dropped for a second. His mother, he explained, was Finnish. He possessed a strong Western bone structure softened by a complexion that spoke of his Eastern heritage. He was, Julian realized with a jolt, truly beautiful, like a figure from an oil painting. An involuntary thought connected him to Leo. Both were masterpieces, divinely sculpted and destined to be adored. For a brief moment, Julian understood Carter's fascination. He looked down at his own hands gripping his silverware, slender and pale, the blue veins a delicate web beneath the skin. They were hands that had held on too tightly for too long. He asked Ethan why he had approached him. Ethan's answer was simple. He said Julian had stood out in the vulgarity of the party, an elegant piece of art that looked as if it were covered in fine cracks. The description made Julian lose his appetite. He set down his fork and met Ethan's intense gaze. He asked what it was Ethan wanted from him. Ethan's look was open, a raw and undisguised fascination. Julian turned his head toward the large window. And there, by a twist of fate, were Carter and Leo on the sidewalk. It was a chilly February night, and Leo was bundled in a silver fur coat, his face buried in the collar as he clutched an ice cream cone. Carter was wrapping his own overcoat around Leo's hands, blowing warm air onto them, his every gesture radiating tenderness. They looked perfect together. Julian had expected a stab of pain, but felt only a profound stillness. He turned back to Ethan, his voice even. The man on the left, he explained, was his fiancée. Ethan's expression froze. He had met Julian at what was essentially a bachelor party. This was not what he had expected to hear. Julian watched him, thinking of Ethan's earnest eyes and of Carter's, which had once held the same fire for him. A laugh threatened to escape, but he smothered it. He clarified that Carter would soon be his ex-fiancée. From his pocket, he produced a hotel keycard and placed it on the table. It was heavy, inlaid with gold, with a single diamond chip in the corner signifying the presidential suite. Ethan stared at the card, the implication dawning on him. There was no surprise or anger on his face, just a quiet understanding. His body shifted almost imperceptibly toward the exit. Julian felt a familiar, dull ache of disappointment and lowered his gaze. After a long silence, he heard the scrape of a chair and saw a pair of simple leather shoes in his line of sight. Ethan knelt beside him and took his hand. He looked up, his blue eyes holding Julian's. He told him that he was cunning, that seeing his expression made it impossible to defy his expectations. Blinking in surprise, Julian watched him rise, pick up the card, and pull him to his feet. Ethan led him swiftly from the restaurant. Once inside the elevator, the doors slid shut and he turned, cupping Julian's face in his hands. He asked if this was revenge for his fiancée's infidelity, then leaned in and kissed him. The world dissolved into a storm of heat and pressure. Julian clung to him, a drowning man grasping at driftwood, carried away by a torrent he hadn't realized he'd been longing for. Morning light filtered into the room. Julian woke tangled in Ethan's arms. He felt a warmth that had been absent for years. He stretched a hand from under the covers, admiring the pink, healthy color of his fingertips. Ethan stirred behind him, pulling him closer. Julian reached back, his fingers sinking into Ethan's messy hair. He had expected Ethan to be gone by morning. Ethan murmured, asking if that was what he had wanted. Julian turned to face him, taking in the faint stubble on his jaw and the youthful intensity in his sleepy eyes. It was a startling echo of a younger Carter, from a time 7 years ago. He closed his eyes and leaned in for another kiss. He had thought returning home would mean a confrontation with Carter, but he and Leo had already left for a trip to Europe. A courier delivered flowers and a gift, a token of Carter's thoughtfulness. It was the latest handbag from a luxury brand. Julian handed it to the housekeeper without a second glance. The housekeeper, who had been with Julian since before he moved in with Carter, asked with genuine concern if his night had been pleasant. He cared for Julian deeply. Julian touched his own neck, where he knew 1 or 2 marks remained. He replied that it should be obvious. The old man shook his head, saying that Julian looked well, and that he was relieved. The simple, kind words struck an unexpected chord. Julian realized he had become so numb to the constant humiliation that he had forgotten what genuine care felt like. A wave of emotion washed over him, and he managed to smile through suddenly blurry eyes before heading upstairs. The following days were spent at his own villa, a smaller home he'd lived in before Carter, preparing to move back permanently. He put Ethan out of his mind, determined to reestablish his independence. He ignored Ethan's texts and calls. A strict boundary was necessary. One Wednesday, he had an engagement with the mayor's wife to attend the opening of a friend's new art gallery. The mayor's wife sent an ostentatious display of flower baskets. Julian brought a few rare prints from his personal collection. Their friend, the gallery owner, was gracious to both but held Julian's arm as he gave them a private tour. The gallery featured mostly emerging artists. The works were wild, quiet, grand, and bright, but they all felt confined within their frames. Julian felt nothing. He was about to purchase a couple of pieces out of obligation when the police chief's wife, another Omega in their circle, leaned in close. She asked what scent he was wearing, noting that it couldn't be pheromones, since he was a beta. Julian stopped and sniffed his wrist. The gallery owner, also an Omega with a heightened sense of smell, leaned toward his neck. He said with certainty that it was cedar, and that it had soaked in deeply. The chief's wife laughed lightly. She'd heard rumors about his fiancée traveling with another Omega and had worried about their relationship, but now she saw they were unfounded. Julian's smile remained perfectly placid. He had no intention of revealing the truth until the separation was complete. But her smile faltered as she remembered something. Carter's pheromones, she said, were brandy. An immediate chill fell over the group. Julian's friend reflexively tightened his grip on his arm. Julian replied smoothly, inventing a new line of hyper-realistic perfumes he'd invested in, a collection called Scent Boyfriend that perfectly simulated alpha pheromones. He offered to send them each a set. Their stiff smiles returned, and they laughed along with him. Suddenly, Julian was bored with the charade. He excused himself and walked ahead, deeper into the gallery. A painting in a quiet corner caught his eye. It was a garden. A barefoot boy sat on the grass, a thorn from a rose bush piercing his toe. He was trying to remove it, but his gaze was fixed on a figure in the garden. A fairy, pale and beautiful like a porcelain statue, but covered in fine cracks from which the roots and thorns of roses grew. Julian looked at the signature in the bottom corner and froze. He checked his watch, then turned back to his friends. He told them he had lied. He did have a new boyfriend, and he was leaving to find him. With a wave, he walked out of the gallery, leaving them speechless. He directed his driver to Ethan's studio, located in a gritty alley near the university campus. The contrast was stark. His luxury car navigating the narrow street, his expensive clothes as he climbed the dark, damp staircase. He knocked on a paint-peeled door. Ethan appeared, wearing a splattered apron, his expression one of pure shock. A handmade sign on the door read "No entry during working hours." Julian stepped over the plastic line demarcating the threshold, pushed Ethan back inside, and shut the door. The studio smelled of turpentine and something else, something rich and alive that felt like cedar. A heat surged through him, starting from his toes. He took Ethan's paint-stained hand and pressed it to his cheek. His soul felt like it was blooming again. Ethan kissed him, asking why he was there. Julian asked if he wanted to have an exhibition, if he needed paintings, if he needed a model. Ethan held him tight, his lips pressing against Julian's ear. He was his muse. He stayed with Ethan for 3 days. When he finally went home, he was wearing Ethan's t-shirt and jeans, the waistband cinched to its tightest setting. He carried a painting Ethan had made for him. Carter was sitting in the living room. He looked up, his expression startled by Julian's appearance. Julian instinctively touched his collarbone, where Ethan's marks were hidden. Carter observed that the rumors of a new boyfriend seemed to be true. Julian ignored him, placing the canvas on an easel and stepping back to admire it. Carter came to stand behind him. He conceded that the painting was good. In it, Julian was half naked on a sofa, his body relaxed and languid, his posture serene. Ethan had painted him beautifully, finding a grace Julian had forgotten he possessed. It was as if he had been seen for the first time. The cracked porcelain vase had grown roots and bloomed. He turned and thanked Carter. His smile seemed to unnerve him. Carter's Adam's apple bobbed. He asked if he could choose his thank you gift. Julian nodded. Carter pulled him into an embrace and began leading him toward the master bedroom. Julian understood his intent, a sudden reassertion of ownership after 2 years of neglect. It was a reminder that Carter still believed he held control. He allowed himself to be placed on the bed, watching with a detached curiosity as Carter loosened his tie, a dark fire in his eyes. He was a magnificent alpha, a golden peacock of a man, and Julian had loved him once. Carter leaned over him, his hand beside Julian's head. He murmured that Julian seemed distracted. His gaze fell to the faint marks on Julian's neck. His thumb traced them, pressing down, as if trying to erase them. He commented on how happy Julian seemed, how possessive this new man was. The pheromones, he noted, were potent. This person had spent a great deal of energy marking a beta, a clear signal to drive others away. As Julian was about to push him off, Carter's phone rang. The ringtone was one reserved for Leo. He answered it without hesitation. His expression shifted, and he hung up, walking briskly toward the door. Julian asked who it was, already knowing the answer. Carter didn't hide it. Leo's heat was starting, and he had to go immediately. Julian found it absurd that Carter hadn't marked him. Carter laughed, admitting he wasn't sure how long his feelings for Leo would last. The admission was startling. Julian had assumed this was true love. He sighed, telling Carter to just break up with him and be with Leo. Carter paused at the door, annoyed. He repeated that Julian was irreplaceable and asked why he was so jealous. He promised to come back and explain everything after Leo's heat passed. Then he was gone. That was the final confirmation. Julian moved out for good, taking the housekeeper with him back to his villa. He let himself fall for Ethan. He shed his old life, trading society gatherings for walks on campus, high-end cuisine for burgers and milkshakes. He spent his days in Ethan's studio, his nights in Ethan's arms. He, in turn, introduced Ethan to his world, to exclusive restaurants, custom-tailored suits, and influential figures in the art scene. Ethan accepted it all with an easy grace, but at night, he would bury his face in Julian's neck, his grip tightening, as if trying to merge them into one being. Julian sometimes felt a pang of guilt, still unable to give Ethan the commitment he deserved after the wreckage of his relationship with Carter. Ethan seemed to understand. He told Julian that loving him was instinctual, that every cell in his body craved him, and that if he could have left, he would have done so long ago. He begged Julian to hold him as if he loved him, too. The words were a spell, and Julian fell deeper. On the 100th day they had known each other, Julian planned a surprise. He bought gourmet ingredients to cook for Ethan. As he was leaving his villa, he found Carter standing at his gate. Carter was shocked that he had actually moved out, revealing he had spent the last few months living with Leo and had never even gone back to their old home. It no longer mattered. Julian stated plainly that they were broken up. Carter apologized for his absence, asking him to come back, admitting he wasn't used to the emptiness of the house without him. He looked at the grocery bags in Julian's hands. He was going to cook for him, Carter realized. A bitter note entered his voice. It had been a long time since Julian had cooked for him. Julian looked at the truffle and caviar, items Carter had long ago grown tired of. He told Carter to have Leo make them for him. Carter's expression fell. He reached for Julian, insisting that Leo was no threat, that most of his heart still belonged to Julian. Julian pulled away, disgusted. He had no more words for him. Carter left, promising to return when Julian had calmed down. Julian drove himself to the studio. The door was unlocked, but Ethan wasn't there. He waited, eventually falling asleep on the sofa. When he woke, it was dark and he was still alone. He called Ethan, who answered in a rush. His professor had dragged him to an art world dinner, and he couldn't get away. Disappointed, Julian got the address. He put the groceries in the small fridge in the corner of the studio and drove to the hotel. He walked into the grand ballroom, his casual attire a stark contrast to the formal wear around him. He no longer cared for these scenes. He spotted Ethan in a corner, looking uncomfortable in his day clothes, trapped in a circle of pot-bellied art dealers led by his professor. Julian was about to approach when a hand landed on his shoulder. It was Carter, looking immaculate in a tuxedo, with a delicately dressed Leo on his arm. Behind them stood another handsome young man, who was staring at Julian with open curiosity. Carter introduced the young man to Julian. Then, with a possessive smile, he introduced Julian as his fiancée. The word hung in the air. Leo averted his eyes. The young man's expression stiffened. Carter draped an arm around Julian, explaining to the newcomer that they had an arrangement to see other people, and that if he wanted to pursue Julian, Carter wouldn't mind. The young man stammered, his eyes darting between them. Julian coolly removed Carter's hand from his shoulder. He looked across the room at Ethan, who still hadn't seen him. He didn't want this night, their night, to be spoiled by Carter's games. He abandoned the idea of going to Ethan. Instead, he took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, turned to the handsome young man, and invited him for a chat in the garden, right in front of Carter. The young man, after a hesitant glance at Carter's thunderous expression, followed. Julian led him to a secluded bench. He patted the seat beside him, and the young man sat down. They clinked glasses. He was the son of an aristocratic family, recently returned from studying abroad. As they spoke, Julian glanced back toward the ballroom doors. Carter was standing there, alone, watching them with an unreadable expression. Julian turned back to his new acquaintance, smiled, and asked him to tell him all about his travels.